All right, here we go. And welcome to our anniversary show for Thoughts on Talks. Yay! Our Black Lives Matter episodes, which is every other episode, and I'll take the cool logo off now. Every other episode, Reverend Mike and I talk with Salaam, and today a special guest, Scott Bowman, about the Black Lives Matter movement to just keep the conversation going and educate our community and learn what we can do to make a difference. So, look what I made you, Scott. I'll show if I can find it. I made a little thing that has your name. There he is.
Right on.
I'm official now.
And I put the right Twitter tag on there, not the old one.
That's the one that gets the use.
There you go.
So today we are joined by a special guest, my friend, Scott Bowman. Dr. Scott Bowman. He's a PhD. I can read the official thing from Texas State.
No.
Oh, come on. Well, okay, I'll just hit the highlights then.
Okay.
You're a PhD in justice studies, right?
That's correct.
And you have edited and authored a 2-volume book, Color Behind Bars, Racism in the U.S. Prison System.
Wow.
I mean, that's impressive. Not just one, but 2 books. And he edits them.
Yeah.
And you're an associate professor. Is that still true?
That's still the truth. Hopefully, at the end of this year, I'll be a full professor. But fingers crossed.
That's at the School of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Texas State University.
Sure.
So that is our guest today. And Thoughts on Talks actually developed out of Reverend Mike's idea to sort of break down his Sunday talks in, the day after or during the week after. And then we added this extra element. So, Reverend Mike, if you would like it to be anchored in your Sunday talk, then I guess you can start us off from there. What do you think?
Well, am I muted?
No.
I can hear you.
Okay. I'll just tell Dr. Scott, I'm going to use doctor because you worked your ass off to get that thing.
Sure.
Somebody should call you doctor today. So, but at any rate, what we were talking about is the Jungian idea of the shadow and how our shadow self projects itself out into the outer world. So how it serves us to number one, know that we have a shadow, and then to do the work in consciousness, then to heal it. And also the other main idea was that you can't have shadow without light, and right. So you can't have a shadow and darkness, and that a shadow is a mixture of both light and dark. And so I just kind of played around with that idea, which is an interesting metaphor for justice and certainly social justice, because it too is a mixed bag of light and dark. So we have the, of course, Lady Liberty or Lady Justice holding the lamp of liberty. And yet we know that particularly given that our focus today is on Black Lives Matter, that justice is not often equally administered. And I only know that as passing, whatever I read in the Washington Post and so forth, a lot of this material that we have been, and the conversations we've been having, I've had friends that I came up with that were people of color, but we're in a whole new arena now that we are learning, and I am learning of some of the ways of the term that many white folks hate, which is privilege, and hate even more, which is white fragility. but we're seeing how this systemic issue has made itself into the consciousness of particularly white bodies, to use Resmaa Menakem's term. Mm-hmm. And I'm also in a book study where we're using my grandmother's hands to explore how trauma influences white bodies, black bodies, and blue bodies. And that whole dynamic, which I imagine the good doctor can speak to in depth. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say again to Salaam how much I appreciate your willingness to do this with us, and Dr. Scott to come on. And so good job, Malayna. And that's really all I intend to do, unless I have a burning desire for a question. But
okay,
I really want to take advantage of having Dr. Scott here, and then and then of course it's always great to hear Salaam's insights. So
yes,
I'll let you guys riff off each other like a hip hop face-off thing.
Well, the thought that occurred to me is, did anything come up for you, Scott, while Reverend Mike was talking that you wanted to jump off from?
A lot, actually.
I figured.
I'm going to try and pace myself, though, but a lot. I think, and it's funny because I was having a conversation earlier today about this same topic, and I think one of the interesting things about now, right, this kind of post-George Floyd awakening, for lack of a better term, is the fact that a couple of things I think happened. I think, one, there was this, and from Dave Chappelle to Richard Pryor, there's always been this kind of joke, right? This ongoing sort of, hey, when we interact with the police, here's what happens. Half truth, half joke. Here's what happens. And I think there's always been this sort of skepticism, right? And then when the Rodney King video was created, then it was, well, yes, that happened, but that's the LAPD. And that's, partially his fault. And, I believe that these things happen, but I think that this is probably an isolated incident. And now that you fast forward, when those kind of discussions would take place where an individual would say, well, if you're Black, maybe you should do this, or maybe you should do that, or maybe, you didn't talk the right way, you didn't do this, you didn't say that. With the increase in technology, we see now where saying I have a gun and that I'm a concealed carry person doesn't matter, or not resisting and obviously having somebody's knee on your neck doesn't matter, and following directions doesn't matter. When there was a video from a couple of years ago with a person in Florida where he says, get your license and registration, and he reaches for his registration and the officer shoots at him, and he said, I was doing what you asked me to do. And so I think what has happened has been almost this kind of evolution of sort of, we're out of excuses. I know the Black community and to a lesser degree, the Latinx community, Native communities have said these things. Poor white certainly have said this because this type of policing is as much a function of class as it is of race. But I think that we've kind of arrived at a point where it's like, there's really no excuses left. It really is just, people of color or African Americans in particular cities, and of a particular perceived socioeconomic status, and that it's happened and it continues to happen, and happens over and over and over again. And I think that in many ways, there's a cross-section of folk in America that looked and said, okay, now that I've accepted that it's true, now that I can no longer reject whatever the Black community was telling me, now I have to accept the fact that it's unacceptable. And I have to kind of step into that space and be an ally, be someone that's, entertaining the discussion, entertaining social action. And I think that change has been the difference, certainly the difference over the past, 8 months, 7 months, and probably unlike anything at least from a criminal justice standpoint, a resistance unlike anything we've probably ever seen before.
Absolutely.
Wow. So one thing, Scott, that I would like you to know about Salaam is that he was raised in Chicago in the South Side. So he brings the perspective from that experience from Chicago. And Salaam Scott was raised in Arizona, and then now he teaches college in Texas. And so we've got a bit of a cross-section of experience here with the two of you. And I saw you nodding a lot, Salaam. Is there anything that you wanted to add to that, or is it just general agreement?
Well, it's all of the above. I mean, a professor had he hit it right on the head, like bop, 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 bop. And to his point, racism hasn't is not new. It's getting filmed. I mean, it was Will Smith put it, and you see, like, to his point also, he said we're out of excuses now. Is like, how much more obvious does it have to be? I mean, because through the years we've seen it where we've had, you'll see a guy that's beat black and blue, but yet they're charging him with assaulting a police officer. I'm like, dude, who's assaulting who? Yeah, you know what I mean? I mean, like dude is all like messed up, So we've seen. I've spoken on this forum before about Move in Philadelphia, like in 1985, when no one, it's really unfathomable to people that the police department in the United States of America would bomb a housing project more largely, and that would target unarmed men, women, and children, and that's 3 years on the heels of Mumia Abu Jamal, is still, in prison to this very day. And I think he's as on dialysis or something of that extent. But this man is going to pretty much die in prison, and we've also had so many other failings.
As is Leonard Peltier, by the way.
I beg your pardon?
I said, as is Leonard Peltier.
Leonard Peltier, yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And then you remember just within the past couple of years, Jay-Z did that special on Netflix about Caleb Browder, a 16-year-old kid who was just merely accused of stealing a backpack, and there was no evidence against him. But when he is a shining light of an example of, if you don't have any recourse financially, or it would be able to afford any type of legal representation or to retain one, the public defender space, I mean, that's like a death knell, to black kids, and long story short, the young brother ended up committing suicide because he just couldn't handle the trauma that he experienced. Then I mean, just highlighting just little points, like there was I forget the talk show, but they had 5 NYPD black officers on there that basically they talked about the climate within NYPD. How is it to police as a black man but behind the shield at the same time? So that cross section, and how they didn't feel the element of safety, even though they were upholding the shield. So we see these kind of dynamics just always play itself over and over again. So it just so happened that probably, and this doesn't sound so great, but the silver lining and number 45, President Trump not handling the pandemic correctly, and it went extensively long, is that people were at home. So people were at home, things were shut down, minds were idle, and you had no choice but to sit there and face the ugly truth ad nauseum, as CNN was hitting you with it, and every major network station was hitting you, with footage like, this is the elephant in the room. And it created a brief sense of relief, I'll be honest. But then as time went on, I just said, okay, wait a minute, where is this leading? Because we've never seen this before. So it's like one of those things where, okay, is it safe for me to drink this drink? You didn't spike this with anything, right? So that skepticism was also bumbling through Black America. Even though at one point there was this brief flashpoint of euphoria that, yeah, we got a coalition, a multicultural, more diverse push, for against police brutality and for socio-economic justice. And then you had all of a sudden Black books became the hot thing. Like we've known about Ta-Nehisi Coates for years, but the mainstream had just found out about him. We've known about Ibram Kendi for years. Mainstream had just found out about him. I didn't hear of anyone who've ever heard of Dr. Kwanzaa Kunjufu, but he's been in the game for well over 30 years. He was the one who, I remember the episode on Donahue, when it was one of the last television episodes that Huey P. Newton was on, where Dr. Kwanzaa Kunjufu basically drew a direct correlation between Black illiteracy and Black incarceration. And he, considering that episode aired in August of 1988, so we're talking 32 years, and now we have an aha moment. You know what I mean? And so,
I'm sorry.
No, please.
I'm wondering if Scott, if you've seen this shift with your students, with what your doctoral students are, studying, teaching. I mean, how has that shown up in your area?
Oh, there's a tremendous shift, and I think so. It's good and bad, right? So on the one hand, it's great because not just the students, but individuals are willing to engage in conversations, and not just white, suburban African-American families that didn't necessarily have those type of experiences with the police, wealthy folks that did, it's difficult to be African-American, Latino, Native American, poor, and not have an adverse interaction with the police at some point. But if you can avoid it by and large, even those folk are now talking about and considering, things like what does abolishing the police mean? What does that look like? What does defunding the police look like? And so there are a lot more folks engaged, and I'll say, at least in my own experience, there are a lot more. The university I'm at is a Hispanic serving institution, and it's a majority minority university. And so there are a lot more students of color that are looking at employment in the criminal justice field as a function of social change, and not just, for the sake of a job, to say, well, I can be a police officer, I can put in my 20 years, get a retirement, those sorts of things, but looking and saying, I feel like I have more of an obligation to figure out how I can have a better impact and how I can improve police community relations. That's the good part. The bad part, the challenge, I think, is that police and policing have been so problematic with regards to African Americans in particular, but pretty much any non-white, non-wealthy group in this country for as long as we've had some sort of function of policing, right? So you have overseers during slavery, you have the Black codes in the South, you have a formal kind of segregation in the North, informal segregation in the North that still reproduces these types of characteristics that exist in the South. You have contemporary police forces that are designed to police Black space. One of the things I talk about when I teach a lot is post-World War II FHA and VA lending as an example, because FHA and VA lending went disproportionately to white servicemen. And I can, because I've showed this movie in class, and I can tell you that the movie is called Erase, The Power of an Illusion. And it's a 3-part series. The third part is called The House I Live In, and it talks about this in more detail. and it says that more than $2 billion, or some ridiculous number that was provided for housing for servicemen, less than 2% went to non-whites, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have redlining, you have all of this kind of segregated spaces, and so then you have Black space, you have Native space, you have Latino space, you have, and everything that goes along with it. So if it's defunded, if it's devalued, if you have segregated or racist policies that impact employment, that impact wealth, opportunities, etc., you create this underfunded, defunded space that is made up of color. And then you say, hey, please police them, but don't police them the way you police us. Police them with vigor and anger and, violence and punishment to make us feel better, right? All of that for policing is essential. But it's a drop in the bucket when we're talking about just the social construction of race overall. One thing I was talking to my daughter about, this is just one example. If you are pregnant and you're an African-American woman, you are twice as likely to die giving childbirth or after childbirth.
Mm-hmm.
If you are an African-American woman with a college degree, you're actually 5 times more likely to die than your white college counterpart, right? There is no other explanation. And usually you go, oh, maybe it's class, maybe it's some other demographic factor that we can't account for. There's no real explanation, right? Other than perceptions of race, misperceptions, stereotypes, implicit attitudes or biases towards, the other, for lack of a better term, whether the other is African-American, Latinx, whatever it may be. But that's a whole nother issue. Education is a whole nother issue. Labor and the labor market is a whole nother issue. Wealth, my dissertation work was on wealth and wealth disproportionality. Wealth and income, or wealth and asset attainment, is a whole nother issue. And so my hope is that we don't stop talking about race. If somehow the policing gets fixed, hell, even in criminal justice, you still have the courts, you still have jails and prisons, you still have all of these other issues, whether it's race and class or the intersectionality of the two. There's just so much to address and try to improve that I'm hoping that the rest of it doesn't get lost in the shuffle with placing too much focus on policing.
Are you raising your hand, Rev?
Yes.
I am raising my hand. Because I just wanted to underscore something that the good doctor just mentioned. So if you just take the idea of wealth accumulation in families, and this is something that's been brought out. I'm not even sure where I learned it. Probably in this class that I'm involved in. But going back to the GI Bill and how it was distributed. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think you used a number of 2%, but I don't know if that was FHA or GI Bill. But there was thousands of soldiers, military, who received loans for buying that first home, which meant very low down, pre-approval. They were building houses like crazy directly for this market. And there were six nationally, 6 loans cut to African Americans.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if that's true. I heard it in a class, but it's infinitesimally small. And the reason why I bring that up is for anyone who may be watching later, that this is real stuff and it's verifiable, and you don't have to dig that far to find it. And if you think about how just within your own family system as wealth has accumulated. So I come from an immigrant family. My dad was military. And so that's how he got a toehold in. And in fact, my mom bought the house when he was away on TDY because he kept saying, no. He didn't want the house payment, right? But later he said if it wasn't for her, they would have never had anything, because that first house, that small, modest house in that modest neighborhood, was their toehold into wealth and asset development. And when you speak to the African American community, the systems put in place, whether it's redlining into neighborhoods or just flat not loaning money to people of color, that you have stripped away wealth development in the richest country in the world for what, 20% of our citizens? I don't know what the number is.
No, it's less than that.
But you know,
account for Native Americans and Latinx that have experienced the same thing.
Well,
you're absolutely right.
And you have a country that was founded in an economic system, right, that kept the folks subjugated. So where is that payoff, right? So, and I'm speaking specifically to enslaved peoples who helped develop the economy of the early United States and certainly the colonies.
Yes.
Right. And then kept it stuck after a failed Reconstruction effort that then turned into Jim Crow. So anyway,
I was looking up while you were talking about that, Rev. I saw a TED Talk from Kedra Newsom Reeves, and it's how to reduce the wealth gap between Black and white Americans. And she kind of does a brief history of just her family and then says, here are 4 things that we can do to help. And one of them is just to help Black Americans and other minorities, other communities that haven't had access to just get on the ladder of banking and credit and all of these things. And to a lot of people don't feel like it's there to support them. And so they don't even engage in banking or that process, and they just don't have access to it. But the education, and then finding what are they called? Credit unions. And I know in Sri Lanka, the Muslim community had their own banking where the rates were different. The rates were lower for lending within that
Sharia.
Yeah, probably. I don't remember what
here is
it was
known
called.
Sharia financing.
Okay.
So it may be worldwide, but I would imagine that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, and obviously, now that I've brought it up, and I hadn't before, but Scott Salaam is representing not only New Thought, because he's part of the Center for Spiritual Living community, but he went to Catholic school and then became an Islamic follower. What is the right term? Is that a good one?
No,
when
you're fine. Muslim, Muslim. Yeah. So, just to give you a brief story, Scott. Just for many Black people, the gateway, or many Black people, I should say, who accept Islam, usually the gateway is through the Nation of Islam. There's just no getting around that. And we've had in the Black community a contentious interaction of sorts with the Arab merchants who have set up shop in the communities. And I remember when I was about 14, 15 years old, our family's gotten along with the merchants where they see us coming here all the time. They knew I was a good kid and causing trouble. But one day when I got comfortable, his English name was John, but his native tongue, it was Yahya, because there's no J in Arabic. And I had asked him, I said, hey, yeah. He said, you know this? I said, yeah. I said, how come you're selling us alcohol and pork shoulder when you don't eat it?
Yeah.
And then he said, what he was like completely dumbfounded that I asked this question. And I said, well, yes. I mean, not only in the Christian Bible, it forbids pork, but also in the very scripture that you have that's sitting on that wall right behind you. That also forbids pork and alcohol consumption, but here you are selling it to us. And then I said, is it because the law is so stringent? Now, what would happen if you were doing this in Mecca or Riyadh, in the Middle East, I mean, they'd likely cut your hand off,
Yeah.
your right hand, and you wouldn't be able to eat, because they're not going to let you in that culture dip your left hand in anybody's food,
Right.
and there's a reason for that. But ever since then, he's called me Muhammad ever since then. So he knew that's the kind of way that I had to gain some sort of respect at that point. And that was nearly around the same time, give or take a week or so, where I began my research in Islam. So.
And I remember Scott also. Now I mentioned this to the Rev, I think, before we began recording, but Salaam, I met Scott in the Youth of Unity. So we grew up in the New Thought movement together. And I remember when you were living in Los Angeles, Scott, and you were going to UCLA, there was a Unity Center, and I think it's still there, that focuses on, and I only say I think it's still there because I never get a response from the mail that I send from Unity, because I'm here representing Unity as well as our center here. But yeah, Reverend Richard Mary Kara Bird.
Yep. He's still there. He's still on.
Richard Bird. He has a program on KPFK on Monday afternoons.
Yes.
Okay, and his focus is on African spirituality.
Yeah, Mary Kara is his name.
Yep.
Right. So
he married my wife and I, by the way.
Wow.
Really?
Yes.
Small world. Yeah, he's still on the airwaves out here on Monday afternoons.
Yep.
Very cool. So where do we go from here? Scott, what was your next point of the many points that came up earlier that you didn't get to talk about?
Well, I think I'm gonna piggyback off what the Rev just said, because I think one of the things that's important, in the context of particularly thinking about class and wealth disproportionality and things like that, is that everything that was described are structural issues, right? So the VA and FHA lending that determines that redlining is an appropriate way to determine who gets into certain spaces, who's excluded from certain spaces, what space becomes valuable and what space isn't. Those are structural factors, right? It doesn't say anything necessarily about the people that live there, other than they were placed there by structures and systems that were beyond their control, right? And so I think one of the ways, ironically enough, and you mentioned this before, Malayna, in terms of here's the TED Talk and it says, hey, you have to provide these opportunities for wealth, et cetera. It's not just providing opportunities, it's providing equality of opportunity, right? Yes. So, and what that means in a roundabout way is that spaces, mostly suburban, would have to be desegregated, would have to be structurally desegregated. You would have to give opportunities for folks of color to be able to move into those spaces. Because one of the challenges, so when you talk about wealth and wealth disproportionality, obviously the spaces that come, especially in the East Coast, so the spaces like Levittown, Pennsylvania, that are created from VA and FHA lending, that becomes essentially white space and therefore wealthy space and valuable space, is only a part of the story. The other part is there are cities like Detroit and Chicago, parts of Chicago, where there are big, beautiful homes that are considered Black space and would never be sold, right? And so if the Black community can't get the banking, doesn't have banking in their neighborhood, doesn't have those resources, they can't buy those houses. And you're not going to convince somebody white or non-Black generally to go into those spaces unless it happens in large space, in large numbers, and then it becomes gentrified, as I know in Los Angeles and Boyle Heights and all of these kind of newly created subspaces.
Inglewood.
But otherwise nobody's moving into those spaces. And so part of that desegregation would have to be this kind of, the suburbs would have to become welcoming, but also central cities would have to kind of become valuable and provide those options, those living options to African Americans. Because even with gentrification, most of the time it moves folks of color out, right? And so they'll claim it's diverse largely because they'll say, well, this used to be a black part of town and this used to be a Latino part of town. But when you look at it and you go, well, the numbers just shrunk to the point where it's predominantly white, as we've seen, like in Brooklyn, Manhattan, et cetera, Harlem, that sort of thing. And so it has to be a twofold kind of strategy that involves people coming together that traditionally in this country have never come together like that, right? There's certainly exceptions, but by and large, we still live in largely segregated spaces. And so, that's one starting point would be to offer those opportunities. And I mentioned the structural part of it because how we see African Americans, how we see Latinx folks, how we see Native Americans as individuals, and the things that we ascribe to, these characteristics that we ascribe to folks that are in spaces, not because they choose to, not because they're lazy, not because they don't want anything better, but because they have been structurally placed in those spaces with little opportunity to get out. We conflate the two, and the two are absolutely separate from one another.
Absolutely.
And so, and the reality of it is, as you mentioned before, going to church in Western in 70, I think it's 78, if I remember correctly, was no less uncomfortable to me than living near UCLA or working in Long Beach. It was just because they're just people. Now, doesn't mean that I want to put myself in an uncomfortable situation, right? So I'm not necessarily going to go into a gang-infested territory at midnight wearing the wrong colors.
Right.
During the day, during the afternoons, during the, shopping, walking, existing, etc. Those places are safe with folks that are just trying to live and survive and do the best that they can in majority. One of the things that gets said around criminal justice circles is that, you have kind of a 10% of the people committing 90% of the crimes. And if there's some truth to that, that means 90% of the folks living in Detroit and Chicago and New York and New Orleans and Atlanta and Los Angeles are just trying to do the best they can with the structures that were placed on them to kind of keep them from having the same types of opportunities.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right. It was what Professor just spoke on. It reminded me of a James Baldwin quote where he said that urban renewal yields black removal. And that's essentially like what gentrification is. And there was an episode that W. Kamau Bell on CNN, where he does the United Shades of America. And one particular episode stuck out to me is when they were in Pittsburgh, I believe, or right outside of Pittsburgh. And literally that was when I looked at that and just saw how when you don't have any industry in the areas that are populated by Black and people of color, I mean, you create, widespread poverty. And then it's easy for folks who are affluent, white, on the outside, looking inside that fishbowl and say, well, how come those people don't pull up themselves by the bootstraps? But you didn't look at Martin Luther King say why they don't have any boots, or what are some of the dynamics that undergird and create that direct result of why that Pittsburgh is the way it is, or why Detroit, as the professor mentioned earlier, was at one point the richest city in the country, but all the auto plants. And many people, I've had relatives who moved up from Alabama to Detroit to work in the auto plants. It's like we're from Chicago. The main industry in Chicago was the stockyards at that time, And when those plants started closing, all these Black folks are left with, no job. Now you can start where folks used to be able to post up at a job for 25, 30 years, retire with a nice pension, got some benefits, able to pass down a house to their kids or something. Now, the next generation doesn't have any recourse. And the way Black folks now, the way we are calculated now as to what we fall in the middle class, we probably fall in the middle class mainly on the basis of income, because we don't have any appreciating assets. I'm speaking in general. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule. And sadly, there are many of us whom, and I've conversed with them somehow or another recently, many of Black people who really think that systemic racism doesn't affect them. And in a lot of ways, the society teaches you how to stay the hand, of white supremacy. And in order to do that, you have to cozy up to it at the same time just to kind of get by. And that hasn't been very helpful to us either, as the numbers dictate that, as many economists, many reports and case studies have been completed that speak to that very thing. So
I remember, Scott, when you were on an episode of my podcast, Pop Conscious, a few years ago, we were talking about what would community policing look like, and you brought up Starsky and Hutch.
Mm-hmm.
You said, "Can you?"
Good
and
one.
I know
That's
so
a good one.
Tell why that is such a good model.
So I have an affection for Starsky and Hutch,
Mm-hmm.
because most every episode, they're just, now to be fair, they're detectives. They're not beat officers or anything like that. But when you watch the show, they go through a series of social interactions within the community to acquire information to make the proper arrest, right? And they know that they're officers. They don't hide it. They interact with people, with folks, and they're like, "Hey, I give you information." Every once in a while, it's which I think is interesting, is they'll come across somebody that's maybe committing a smaller crime, and they'll say, "Hey, I'll leave you alone if you give me more information about the next person." But it's very different, and the easiest way to juxtapose that, and I know it's a TV show, right? But when you look at cops and some of the reality-based kind of policing programs, where it's the pursuit, it's the tackle, it's the arrest, it's the usually violent arrest, it's very different. Our view of policing is very different, right? Community policing is in the community, right? It's being in the community. And I spoke on a panel. I'm going to say what I said in this. I was on a panel earlier this year. Part of community policing is entering into a social contract between the police and the community, right? Yes. So you say, just like any social contract, like when I give out a syllabus in class, I go, "Hey, this is our social contract. This is what we're going to do this semester. This is what I'm sticking to." Police and the African-American community in particular have never had a social contract.
Right.
Everyone else has always dictated what the police do and how they police Black space and Latino space and Native American space, which is even more crazy when you think about Native Americans as having semi-sovereign land, but still reporting to the Fed, still having interactions or collaborations, for lack of a better term, with local sheriffs, county sheriffs, things like that. But African Americans have never had a social contract with the police. Other folks have told the police how to police Black communities and Black space, whether it's legislators, politicians, other communities, right? We don't want that problem coming into our space, right? And we know that it happens unequally, right? So there are ways in which, South Los Angeles gets policed different than the kind of north of the 10, so to speak. There are ways in which poorer communities of color get policed differently than wealthier communities, including high schools, right? We generally don't talk about 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds being pulled out of handcuffs in private schools and Montessori programs, right?
That's right.
And so, those things are very different, community policing would be police officers entering into a social contract with the community that they're supposed to police and saying, here's what we want, here's what we need. And the community saying, here's what we can give you, here's what we don't want, and coming to an agreed upon kind of construct, right? So police, African-American communities, all communities want policing to a certain degree, right? Nobody wants to feel unsafe. People want to be able to call if something is going on beyond their control. I don't know that anybody wants to be stopped and frisked, right? I don't know that anybody says, oh, but by the way, please stop all of us anytime you feel like it. Stop us, frisk us, ask us where we're going, check us for weapons and drugs. And then if I move on to the next person, please let them do that too, right? Nobody says I want to be racially profiled. Nobody says, hey, if I look like my car is too nice, or I look like my car is too old, or my one tail light is out, or a license plate light is out, or whatever it may be, that I please, by all means, use that as a justification to run warrants, searches, seizures, etc. Nobody asks for that, right? And so part of community policing would ultimately be this sort of, you know what, we will do these things to help facilitate your job. You help us by getting rid of the 10%, right? And leave the rest of us alone. And if you know us and you know us as a community, you'll know the difference between the two.
Right.
And that's why I use the Starsky and Hutch example, because they didn't just walk up and just punch black people in the face. Like, I just thought he was a bad guy, or we made a bad arrest. It's like they asked questions, they investigated, they knew who they were looking for. But they interacted with, most everybody, unless they were like lower level criminals, with a measure of respect. They talked to citizens with respect, regardless of their race or background. And they said, hey, this is helping you as much as it helps us. We're not here to shake you down or to, attack everybody or whatever. We're just trying to get the person that committed this crime. And that's very different than what most communities of color experience.
Reverend Mike, you had your hand up. Oh, hold on. You're muted. Did we both try to unmute you at the same time?
Yeah. I actually just had a question. And I hope this doesn't come across as too harsh, but do you think that law enforcement attracts bullies? And do you think there's any effect on, and I love the NFL and I love football, but it sure seems like our national pastime is influencing the way we operate with each other, including shows like Cops.
So I'm not sure about the NFL part, but I can definitely tell you that the first part is an unequivocal yes. Right? Not so much that it attracts bullies, but every city is different. But one of the things that police officers have found over the past, I'd say 10 years, 15 years or so, that their advertisements, their commercials, their recruitment commercials, their billboards were always showing action, right? So it was, the middle of an arrest or the SWAT team or something like that, that if you're looking for a job and you say, that looks like fun, or not to pick on specifically on folks coming from the military, but you look and say, that looks like what I was just doing in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever it may be. I want to do more of that, right? And, and it is talked about as this kind of warrior mentality, this warrior methodology. And so, it wasn't necessarily attracting bullies, but it was attracting individuals that wanted action, right? And so they weren't necessarily there to be touchy-feely. They weren't necessarily there to get to know people in the community and actually interact with people and spend time, in a community out of uniform, right? It was much more this sort of, I joined for the action. I joined so that I can join the no-knock warrant team and bust into people's doors and, and that was the attraction, and that was the story. And there are many police departments that have changed over the past few years, changed their recruitment kind of standards and what they're presenting as actual policing, because that's not really, most police officers don't have that experience anyway, right? Now, some cities maybe more than others, but most of them never have that experience. It's talking to people, it's interacting with people on a micro level, and with very little action. And so I think there are instances, even when you talk about perceptions of escalation, right? So we look at a video and we go, well, that escalated quickly. Where it's like you start to wonder, well, were they looking for action? Were they just trying to create something where some action would take place so that they could jump in and do these things? And in fact, and I'll say this and I'll stop it. There was a story in Williamson County in Texas, which is probably about an hour north of here. There was an individual that was on live PD, and he was killed. And they live PD buried the tape, and the tape was resurfaced somehow. And what they found was that it was the county sheriffs. They found that their interactions, because they stayed with them over an extended period of time, their interactions were very different than they would be otherwise. They were much more physical. They were much more reactive. They were much more antagonizing than they would be otherwise. And, part of that is this sort of, we have a show to sell. And if they're selling the show and people are watching it and you're 18, 19, 20, because, I teach in a criminal justice program, but you don't have to have a bachelor's degree to be a police officer. And so you look and you say, well, I think I want to do that. That looks like fun. That looks like the excitement that I've been missing. I think that's what it attracted more than anything else.
And to add to what Professor just stated, we've all known that guy in high school. You can assess people back then, and you could see like where folks' lives take them to present day. And you're like, damn, so-and-so became a police officer. And I shared a story about on another Thoughts on Talks a few months ago about a guy that I went to high school with, white guy. And he was cool as hell. We were in class together, went on retreats together, the whole nine. He was telling me about his upbringing in the Beverly neighborhood, Mount Prospect neighborhood, which is mostly Irish, white folks. And I was telling him about my upbringing in the Inglewood area, 7th District, in Chicago. And come to find, people would pick on him. He would always be like the butt end of jokes. He was really self-effacing. Basically the guy, speaking generally, like the guy who like maybe his girlfriend dumped him for the quarterback, or some other dude came and and scooped his girl off of, that kind of stuff. And it puts these folks in these isolated like social like spaces, to where they don't know like who they are, where they're like their self-esteem is low. So I can kind of see that as you pose that question, Rev. And as I restated for Dr. Scott to hear, is that this fella, who we chopped it up, we kicked it, all that stuff while we were in high school, graduated and everything. I looked up his record, because you can, thankfully for technology, you can access all of this stuff. And he had like 16 use of excessive force complaints, cases against him. And I think probably, if I had to take a guess, probably 8 or 9 of them stuck, and he's still there. Yeah. And when I look at the map of where those reports occurred, 2 blocks from the house, around the corner in the alley from where I grew up. I'm like, damn, like I tried to tell you like what it was like growing up in Inglewood, and here, like, what if I was still in Chicago? What if I was still there? It's likely he could have snatched me up, pulled up on me, and I would have like gotten a business, in the alley, or like, as I mentioned before, you remember there were times where like oftentimes, and many people that I know from Chicago could attest to this, that you'll be taken for a ride, and if you live in where I lived at on 61st Street, they'll take you for a ride. You'll end up somewhere on at the back of the yard is what they call it. Back of the yard is behind the stockyards, where you run across some vice lords or some Puerto Rican gangs, some 2-6s, and if you don't give the police officers what they want, they'll put you out the car, take your shoes, and say good luck getting home. And you're screwed. You know what I'm saying? So that was like the nightmare, to be like at a police officer's whim, at that time. But what's in the psyche of someone that kind of, frankly, they get off on doing, inflicting pain and inflicting discomfort, or I'm gonna at your expense, I'm gonna recover what I lost in my youth. I'm gonna recover and show that I'm a bigger man now. Now I'm an adult. Now I can do something about it. And so it's really it's sad when you really think about it, but it's interesting just how the human experience is, and how can it make effects on you to make life altering decisions on somebody else when you're in a position to do it.
And the warrior mentality, there is a higher version of the warrior mentality that it looks for where the peace is and where the center is, and when you have to fight and when you don't. Mm-hmm. And so it's almost like like the media focuses on violence and drama and the news. That focus has changed our whole society to be kind of addicted to that. And that filters down into personal interactions.
Movies too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we've got a few minutes left. Scott, do you have any closing thoughts to share with us? Or do you want to cram all the rest of your thoughts into a small space?
No other thoughts other than, I think one of the challenges is this, the idea that we're all children of God is the easiest way to say it. We're all children of God. And I think for everything that's been talked about, this idea that we forget that sometimes, or we have decided somehow that somebody is less worthy or less valuable or less whatever. I think that way of thinking, this kind of restoration of kind of our collective humanity, is at the source of changing this, right? Because, like the example of, I'm going to drive you out to this place that I do all the time because I didn't just choose this place once, right?
Right.
Salaam's point, and take your shoes and leave you out there. You look and you go, there's no human being that deserves that. Right. There is no human being that deserves that type of treatment. And the only way that you can do that, regardless of your background, your upbringing, your whatever, is to somehow make the distinction between us and them. Right. This idea that we are the police, we are whatever it may be. And the other is these communities, the poor communities, and I know obviously it's we're talking about Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter is essential, but poor white policing is not as bad, but it's not good. And, they're treated more like poor than they are white, the privilege of value of whiteness and that construct. And so this idea that it's like that life has value, that life has worth, and is worth more than a knee on someone's neck, an immediate gunshot from a police officer, the decision to take you out in the middle of nowhere and do Lord knows what. I mean, to walk home, and we know this historically, just the ability to walk home is sometimes the exception to the rule, right? We know that there are African-American men that did not come back from those type of rides, north, south, east, and west, right? But this idea that somehow, it's less than, and you people, and you deserve, and those sorts of things, and returning to this idea that you're talking about children of God, that you're talking about people that have value and have worth, and understanding the structures by which they've been placed there. And then it's not this sort of, I just decided to find the poorest, place to live with no jobs and no future and no, I choose, is a little short-sighted. And so I think that, it's probably not necessarily a popular, response. But I think that that's the key. I mean, I think I would be remiss to, in the context of a spiritually driven, show, to not talk about the fact that, we're still talking about children of God, especially when we talk about juveniles and juvenile justice.
Yeah.
We're literally talking about children of God, and how we arrived at the point of arresting and handcuffing little kids, and sending them to detention centers, and all of these other things is probably a whole nother show. But just this sort of like this check, and I'm hoping that this kind of post George Floyd is a part of that check, but arriving at this sort of what are we doing moment, and why are we treating each other this way? Not just why are we treating them this way, but how have we created a structure by which we're allowing and sanctioning and supporting this type of interaction to take place? And I think that there are a lot of people, certainly, this show being a part of that, that are uncomfortably asking and addressing those questions. So kudos.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
And any final thoughts from you, Rev or Salaam?
Well, I would just say this. So, given that you're an author, Scott, I too am an author. This is my book, and I want to impress you with how thick it is.
Sometimes the best books are the shortest reads, and that's for sure.
Not quite an equivalent.
Yes, Reverend Mike's book is Blue Collar Spirituality, Finding a God That Works.
That's right.
And it's available on Amazon. It makes a great Christmas gift for all those watching the show. Hey.
It's featured on Salaam's screen there, right over his right shoulder.
Right there.
A place of honor.
So, how about you, Salaam? You have anything you want to?
Yeah, I mean, underscoring it all. I mean, yeah, we are children of God. We are children of the Most High. Like even like that's why I selected the shirt today. This shirt is a inscription of Surah 940, which means do not grieve, for Allah is with us. And in our Christian family of Christian friends, they have the name Emmanuel, which means God is with us, as well. So it was in the name of inclusion. It was in the name of opening a space for our dear brother, Professor Scott Bowman, to join us, and I'm happy that he did. I'm happy that he shared his expertise and his perspective, like, even though, like, to your earlier point, Malayna, we did come from different spheres, but we still have the same dermatological sheath, and that's not going anywhere. And just he and I, we've been that, for a minute now. So, but it was good.
New police stories.
That's right. That's right. And like I said, I'm happy that we're able to expand the conversation, a bit. I know the jury is still out. Things are still early for what's going to happen with, cabinet selections and when the transition of power takes place. But I know that's up here. I know this work starts locally, obviously, and somewhere in the twain shall meet, wherever point that may be. But we'll see, and we'll continue to, take those steps in that direction, and build.
Right.
Thank you. And happy belated birthday, Scott. And everybody can prepare your gift list for me. My birthday's coming up.
Happy early birthday.
Definitely.
Thank you. So we're all celebrating also the anniversary show. We've been doing Thoughts on Talks for a year now.
I wish I was prepared with my Tony Tone song. It's our anniversary.
Send me a link and I'll add it in the notes.
You got it. I'll fire it away.
All right, great. Well, thank you all.
Thank you for a great year. You've really brought tremendous energy and expertise and technological prowess, and just a fun vibe. So thank you for your,
Mike.
Congrats on the anniversary.
Absolutely.
and thanks for your time, Doc.
And the important work.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. So thank you, Scott. Thank you, Salaam. Thank you, Reverend Mike. Thank you, viewers. And happy everything.
Take care, everyone.
Happy Gringles.